A man driving home from a hospital bedside at 11:40 at night, still dressed in his clerical collar, exhausted from hours spent praying with a dying parishioner's family. Within 4 minutes, he would be standing on the side of the road in handcuffs while the mayor of the city he served picked up her phone to a call that would end with her standing in the police chief's office before sunrise. This is the story of a wrongful traffic stop, a city government thrown into open crisis, and the night one officer's casual disrespect collided with 30 years of quiet, unshakable influence. Reverend Samuel Okafor was 56 years old and had led one of the city's largest congregations for nearly 2 decades, a church whose membership included judges, business owners, school teachers, and, for the past 11 years, the mayor herself, who had first walked through its doors as a grieving young city council member after losing her husband and had never stopped attending since. Samuel had officiated her wedding when she remarried 4 years later, baptized both of her children, and sat beside her hospital bed during a health scare that had never made the papers, holding her hand through hours she'd later describe as the most frightened she'd ever been. He had never once treated that relationship as anything beyond what it was. A pastor caring for a member of his flock who happened to also run the city, and the mayor had come to value that quiet consistency more than almost anything else in her demanding public life. Beyond the pulpit, Samuel had spent decades building a quiet, deeply trusted relationship with the city's leadership, serving as an informal but deeply valued spiritual advisor to 3 consecutive mayors called upon not for public ceremony, but for the private, difficult moments that never made it into any official record. The late-night conversations before a difficult policy decision, the prayer offered quietly before a press conference following a tragedy, the steady presence in a hospital waiting room when a public servant needed someone who wasn't asking anything of them in return. He kept no record of these moments, sought no credit for them, and most of the city had no idea the role he played behind the scenes of decisions they read about, only in the next morning's headlines. That night, Samuel had spent nearly 5 hours at the bedside of an elderly church member whose family had asked him to come the moment the doctors delivered their final prognosis. He had sat with the woman's 3 adult children, prayed with them in the small hours when the hospital corridor grew quiet, and helped them begin the impossible task of saying goodbye to their mother while she could still hear them. He left the hospital well past 11, still in his black clerical shirt and white collar, exhausted in the particular way that came only from carrying someone else's grief for hours without setting any of it down himself. The city had seen a string of late-night break-ins targeting parked vehicles in residential neighborhoods over the previous 2 weeks, prompting an uptick in patrol presence and a department-wide advisory to remain alert for unfamiliar vehicles moving slowly through residential areas after dark. It was a broad, almost meaningless instruction in practice, the kind that left enormous room for individual officer interpretation, and interpretation was exactly what determined what happened next. Samuel was driving slower than usual that night, partly from exhaustion, and partly because he was scanning street signs in an unfamiliar part of town, having taken a different route home to avoid a closed road near the hospital. To a tired mind watching from a patrol car, a vehicle moving cautiously through residential streets at midnight, pausing slightly at intersections, fit the exact profile that advisory had warned about. Officer Greg Bannerman had been with the department for 8 years, and carried a quiet but persistent frustration that his most aggressive stops rarely produced the kind of significant arrests he believed his instincts deserved. He'd been parked at a dark intersection for the better part of an hour, restless and increasingly eager for something, anything, to justify the late shift when Samuel's sedan rolled slowly past, pausing at the stop sign a beat longer than Bannerman considered normal. He pulled out behind the car, lights flashing on almost immediately. Samuel, more weary than alarmed, pulled over smoothly, already reaching for his license and registration before the officer had even reached his window. "Evening, officer," Samuel said, rolling down his window, his clerical collar plainly visible in the dome light he'd switched on. "Is there a problem?" "License and registration," Bannerman said flatly, flashlight sweeping across the car's interior, across Samuel's collar, without any visible recognition of what it represented. "You were driving suspiciously slow back there. Where are you coming from this time of night?" "I was at the hospital with a family from my congregation," Samuel said, handing over his documents. "I'm a pastor. I apologize if my pace seemed unusual. I was looking for the turn onto Bellwether." He offered the explanation plainly, without any defensiveness, the way he might explain himself to anyone curious about his evening, never once imagining the collar visible in his own dome light might fail to register at all. "Step out of the vehicle," Bannerman said, already pulling the door handle before Samuel had finished responding. "Officer, may I ask why? I've given you my license. I haven't done anything beyond drive slowly through an unfamiliar intersection. We've had break-ins in this area. Your behavior matched the pattern. Step out of the vehicle, now." Bannerman's voice had taken on a sharper edge, the kind of escalating impatience that came from a man who had decided, somewhere in the previous 30 seconds, that compliance and explanation weren't going to be enough. Samuel stepped out slowly, his exhaustion now mixing with a deep, weary disbelief. "Officer, I'm a pastor. I've been sitting with a dying woman's family for the last 5 hours. I'm simply trying to get home. I don't understand what about this situation suggests a break-in." "Turn around. Hands on the car." Bannerman's hand had already moved to his cuffs, his tone leaving no room for further conversation. "This is unnecessary," Samuel said, his voice rising slightly now, not in anger but in the particular frustration of a man too tired to summon the patience this moment seemed to demand. "I'm not resisting, but I would like to understand why a pastor in a collar, having just left a hospital, is being treated like a burglary suspect." Bannerman cuffed him anyway, the cold metal closing around wrists that, hours earlier, had been folded in prayer beside a hospital bed. He placed Samuel in the back of his cruiser, radioing in the stop with language that made no mention of the collar, the explanation, or the calm, cooperative demeanor Samuel had maintained throughout. "Got one matching the residential burglary pattern. Brought him in for questioning, somewhat uncooperative," Bannerman reported. A description that bore little resemblance to what had actually transpired, but would, for the next several hours, shape how every subsequent officer who encountered Samuel approached him. Samuel sat in the back of the cruiser in silence, watching the familiar streets of his own city pass by through a metal grate. His collar still visible, his mind running not toward anger but towards something closer to weary sorrow at the particular, persistent indignity of having to prove, yet again, despite decades of service, that he belonged exactly where he was. He thought of the families he'd consoled after similar humiliations over the years, the quiet anger he'd helped them set down so it wouldn't consume them, and found himself, for the first time in a long while, struggling to extend that same grace to his own circumstance. He recognized the irony of it even as it happened. A lifetime spent counseling others through exactly this kind of injustice. Now sitting alone with no one beside him to offer the same steady presence he had given so freely to everyone else. At the precinct, the booking sergeant, a woman named Carla Jennings, who had worked the late shift for over a decade, looked up as Bannerman walked Samuel through the door, his collar immediately catching her attention. "Bannerman, is that Reverend Okafor?" she asked, already half rising from her chair, recognition dawning with visible alarm. "You know him? Everybody who's worked this department for more than a year knows him. He gave the indication at the police memorial service last spring. He's close with the mayor." Jennings was already moving around the desk, reaching for the cuff key. "Reverend, I'm so sorry. Let's get these off you right now." Samuel, rubbing his raw wrists, spoke with the same measured calm he used at every difficult bedside he'd ever sat beside. "I'd like to call someone, please, and I'd like an explanation for why I was treated this way." Within 20 minutes, Samuel had made one phone call, not to a lawyer, not to the press, but to the mayor's personal cell phone, a number she had given him years earlier specifically for moments she knew would matter more than any official channel could capture in time. She answered on the second ring, her voice instantly alert despite the late hour. And within the span of that single conversation, the trajectory of the entire incident shifted entirely. Mayor Diane Castellano was at the precinct within 25 minutes, still in the casual clothes she'd thrown on the moment she hung up the phone, her expression carrying the particular fury of someone whose personal and professional worlds had just violently collided. She walked past the booking desk without pausing, found Samuel sitting quietly in a waiting area, and embraced him before saying a single word to anyone else in the room. For a long moment, the most powerful person in the city said nothing at all, simply held onto the man who had held her through some of the hardest nights of her own life. Samuel, I am so sorry. I am so deeply sorry." She turned to the night shift commander, her voice now carrying the unmistakable weight of executive authority rather than personal friendship. "I want to know exactly what happened here tonight, and I want it documented honestly, not however it was first radioed in." The night shift commander, visibly rattled by the mayor's presence and the gravity of her tone, assured her a full incident report would be filed by morning. The mayor's presence at the precinct in the middle of the night, embracing a handcuffed pastor with visible familiarity, was not something that stayed contained for long. A night shift dispatcher's spouse, working in local media, had already heard enough second-hand details by morning to begin making calls, and by the following afternoon, the story had moved well beyond department walls, picked up first by a local affiliate and then, within days, by national outlets drawn to the unusual collision of faith, city government and policing. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Samuel told the mayor directly, even as she pressed him to let her handle everything personally. "I'm asking for the same basic respect any person deserves when they have done nothing wrong. This isn't about who I know. It's about what happened to me, and what's happened, I suspect, to people in this city who don't have a mayor's number saved in their phone." The mayor was quiet for a long moment after he said it, the kind of silence that suggested she understood exactly what he meant and exactly how much harder the real work in front of them was about to be. The formal investigation that followed was unusually thorough, driven by both the mayor's direct involvement and Samuel's own insistence that the review extend beyond his individual case to examine whether similar stops had occurred for other residents without his particular relationships to soften the outcome. He had told the mayor plainly, in the days following his release, that he had no interest in this becoming a story about how a powerful person's pastor got special treatment after the fact. What mattered to him was whether ordinary members of his own congregation, people with no number to call and no mayor to embrace them at a booking desk, had endured the same thing without anyone ever noticing. Investigators pulled Bannerman's dashcam footage, which captured the entire interaction clearly: Samuel's calm cooperation, his immediate identification as clergy, his explanation of the hospital visit, and Bannerman's escalation to physical restraint, despite none of it constituting any reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. The footage also captured something investigators found particularly damning: a roughly 4-second pause after Samuel first mentioned being a pastor, during which Bannerman's posture and tone showed no discernible shift at all, suggesting the explanation simply hadn't registered as relevant information worth reconsidering his approach over. A broader review of Bannerman's stop history over the preceding year revealed a pattern that troubled investigators considerably: a disproportionate number of stops involving black residents in the same general area, the vast majority resulting in no citations or arrests, a statistical pattern that, on its own, hadn't previously triggered any departmental review. The department's own data analyst, asked to compile the figures for the investigation, noted that Bannerman's stop-to-citation ratio was nearly 3 times lower than the department average, a discrepancy that, taken together with the demographic pattern, painted a picture investigators described internally as long overdue for scrutiny. In his interview, Bannerman attempted to argue that Samuel's slow driving pattern had created genuine, reasonable suspicion independent of any other factor, insisting race had played no role whatsoever in his assessment. The lead investigator, a department veteran specifically assigned given her background in use of force review, pressed him directly. "Officer Bannerman, the individual you stopped was wearing visible clerical attire, explained calmly and immediately where he was coming from and why, and offered no resistance at any point in this interaction. At what specific moment did slow driving near a stop sign become sufficient justification for handcuffing a cooperative 60-year-old man?" "I had a feeling something was off," Bannerman said, his earlier confidence noticeably thinner now under direct questioning. "A feeling," the investigator repeated flatly, "is not a standard this department's own policy permits as the basis for physical restraint, and I think you understand that as well as anyone in this room." Bannerman's answer, that he had just had a feeling, became a focal point of the investigation's final report, cited as evidence of exactly the kind of unsubstantiated, instinct-driven policing the department's own policy explicitly prohibited absent specific, articulable facts. Officer Bannerman was terminated within 3 weeks. The the department's review citing a documented pattern of disproportionate stops absent reasonable suspicion, culminating in the unlawful detention of a community religious leader without cause. He was additionally referred to the state's licensing board, which suspended his certification pending further review of the broader stop pattern uncovered during the investigation, a process that would later examine several other incidents flagged by the same statistical review. The city settled with Reverend Okafor for an undisclosed sum that, according to people familiar with the negotiation, exceeded $1 million, though Samuel insisted from the outset that any settlement be paired with structural change rather than stand alone as a private resolution. He had turned down an initial larger offer specifically because it came without any commitment to policy reform, telling the city's negotiating team plainly that he wasn't interested in being made comfortable while the underlying problem went unaddressed for the next person who didn't have his particular standing to push back. The department, under direct pressure from both the mayor's office and the broader public attention the incident had drawn, instituted a new policy requiring documented, specific justification for any traffic stop based on vague, suspicious activity advisories, along with a mandatory quarterly review of individual officers' stop patterns to identify potential bias before it escalated into incidents like the one Samuel had endured. The mayor's office also funded an independent community oversight board, staffed in part by clergy and community leaders from across the city's various neighborhoods, tasked with reviewing complaint patterns the department's own internal systems had repeatedly failed to flag on their own. Samuel donated his portion of the settlement to a fund supporting families navigating end-of-life hospital stays, the same kind of support he'd been providing quietly without compensation for decades. He expanded the fund to include a small stipend for chaplains and community pastors who, like him, spent unpaid hours at hospital bedsides across the city, a quiet acknowledgement of work that rarely received recognition even when it shaped a community in ways far more lasting than any single headline. He returned to his pulpit the following Sunday and addressed the incident directly with his congregation, choosing not anger but a measured call toward accountability, telling them, "I was not afraid that night. I was tired, and I was disappointed because I know exactly how differently that encounter could have ended for someone without 30 years of relationships built into this city." That is the part we still have work to do on. The congregation, many of whom had heard fragments of the story already from local news, listened in a silence that Samuel later described as the most attentive he'd ever experienced from that pulpit, the weight of recognition settling over a room full of people who understood, intimately, exactly what he meant. Mayor Castellano attended that Sunday service, sitting in her usual pew near the back, and stayed afterward to help fold programs and tidy folding chairs, exactly as she had on countless ordinary Sundays before the night that had briefly made her congregation's pastor the center of a citywide reckoning. She didn't make a speech. She didn't reference the incident from the pulpit or call attention to her own presence. She simply did what she had always done in that building, which Samuel later said was, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of consistency the moment had needed most. The story is a reminder that even decades of quiet trust and service offer no automatic protection from a single moment of careless judgment, and that real reform requires institutions willing to examine not just the incident that became public, but every quieter version of it that never had a mayor's phone number to call. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more true stories of justice finally catching up.